Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poni. A few days ago, I got pulled into a brief yet strange back and forth on Facebook with someone I don't know about Chopin's well-known death mask. We'll call the person in question Nadia. Nadia seems to have knowledge of all things Chopin and displayed great assurance in discussing the mask, which she seemed to have studied in great detail. The original post we were commenting on, however, had nothing to do with Chopin's death at all, but, interestingly, with his birth. The post featured a picture of the plaque that was affixed in 1897 on the building at 12 Place Vendôme in Paris, where Chopin died on October 17, 1849. The plaque states that Chopin was born in Żelazowa on February 22, 1810. And of course, many people commented on the photo, arguing that Chopin was actually born on March 1st, 1810, not February 22nd. In fact, Chopin claimed so himself several times, including in a statement he signed in 1833 when he joined the Polish Literary Society of Paris. We clearly see the date and place of birth written in his handwriting under his signature, born on March 1st, 1810 in Żelazowa, Mazovian Voivodeship. We also have other sources, including a letter that Chopin's Scottish pupil Jane Stirling wrote on March 1st, 1851 to Chopin's sister Ludwika, recounting her visit to Chopin's grave. We brought him flowers. Not many know when his birthday is, and I'm glad about it. He once told me, only my mother, that is my family, the headmistress of the boarding house, and you, madam, know the day of my birth, and you will remember it. So we are not dealing with a lack of sources. We actually have multiple strands of evidence pointing towards March 1st. Why February 22 then, and where does it come from? We find this information in the baptismal records of the Church of St. Roch and John the Baptist in Brochov, an entry dated April 23, which lists Chopin as being born on February 22. Here is the date clearly readable in the register. Before I engage with Nadia, someone cited Alan Walker's biography, Chopin, A Life and Times, which also adopts March 1st. Nadia replied to this comment quite firmly. It will never be fully clear. Even Mr. Walker, with all due respect, can just assume and, according to the primary sources available, can take a position. He did so, but he can't know why this contradiction exists, and neither can anyone else today. Now, in a strict philosophical sense, one can question pretty much anything that is not a direct surviving record. For example, any anecdote recounted by someone who knew Chopin cannot be taken at face value. If one of Chopin's students wrote back home and recounted one of their lessons to their parents, for instance, we should then doubt that that's how the lesson went, or doubt that the lesson happened at all. But practically speaking, that's not what we do. We tend to believe these accounts, mostly because we believe that those people were sincere, and because they give us a more complete picture of Chopin, the man, and the musician. And we can still weigh evidence and question a direct surviving record, though we can do so only at a speculative level, of course. And in this case, we do have to ask, which source is stronger? The parish baptismal record, which is where February 22 is listed as Chopin's birthday, and where, as we discover, the last name Chopin was misspelled, though, to be fair, it could be that Chopin's father spelled his last name that way to avoid mispronunciations, or Chopin's own repeated statements and family testimony pointing to March 1st. Should we doubt Chopin's parents or Chopin himself? What were they hiding? Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, in his 1955 monograph on Chopin, opens with a small vignette that captures the problem perfectly, and that is a useful reminder of how these records were actually produced. Sometimes the smallest, most insignificant events can unleash an unexpected flood of ink. 2 days after Easter, the vicar of the parish of Brochov, near Sokashev, returned to his church after baptizing a newborn at the manor in Zhelazovovola. As he began to draw up the child's birth record, he could not possibly have imagined the consequences his moment of distraction would have in the future. "When was this child born?" he asked the organist. The organist was already tipsy. The baby's father, a good Frenchman, was something of a wine connoisseur. "How should I know?" he replied. "They said he was about 2 months old." 2 months, the priest reflected. So he must have been born on February 23. Then put down February 23 as the date of birth. Perhaps it wasn't exactly 2 months. Then make it February 22. "Right," said the organist, and began drafting the record, reading aloud as he wrote. "I, the undersigned Josef Moravsky, vicar of the parish of Brochov, have administered the holy sacrament of baptism to the newborn, born at, on, to the esteemed Mr. Nicholas." "How do you spell that name?" he asked the priest. "God only knows. It's just a name. Spell it however you like." "Son of Mr. Choppen." Perhaps the scene in the sacristy of the old church in Brochov really did unfold like this. Now, of course, the point of the vignette in Ivashkiewicz's monograph is to underscore how fragile precision could be in parish records of that time. In fact, he continues, "Mistakes like this in birth records were quite common. Baptisms were usually performed at home, and the organist will later prepare the necessary document and enter the child into the parish register, often introducing errors along the way. The result was a host of inaccuracies. Even the author of these lines has been the victim of such a mistake and has never managed to sort it out, with unexpectedly troublesome consequences. It was only in the 1920s that a decree required baptisms to be performed in church rather than at home, precisely to avoid such errors." So, when we return to the question of the exact date of Chopin's birth, we are not choosing between certainty and ignorance. We are weighing different kinds of evidence. One, a formal parish record, possibly produced under indirect and approximate conditions. And two, consistent personal testimony from Chopin himself and those close to him. Which one carries more weight? It depends on how strictly one prioritizes administrative documentation over lived testimony. Well, when posed this question, Nadia claimed that the fact that Chopin considered March 1st to be his birthday and that his family celebrated it is not proof, but circumstantial evidence. People celebrate the birthday they have been told is theirs, which, in an absolute sense, can be true. But the notion that nothing can be known is, in my view, overstated. Just about anything can be true then, or not, including the entry in the registry as Saint Roch and John the Baptist in Brochov. In any case, it was at this point that the discussion took a strange turn from birth records to death masks. In the same comment about Chopin's birthday, Nadia shifted the topic entirely. Nor can he, Alan Walker, know whether the death mask was actually embellished by Clésanger, as he is convinced, or whether it was not rather Chopin's face that Clésanger restored to a more lifelike state using oil and massage. The original plaster casts of Chopin's mask match his daguerreotypes perfectly. That the plaster casts match the daguerreotypes is true, but it was, after all, Chopin's face that was being captured in the impression, and we can see that in the comparisons provided by Jack Gibbons in his blog. Now, Nadia's statements require context. A death mask is created by taking a direct impression of the deceased's face using materials like plaster, wax, or clay to form a negative mold. Once the mold sets, it is removed and filled with plaster, wax, or bronze to create a precise, positive, and lasting likeness, often used for memorialization or as a model for portrait busts. Photographic portraiture was available since 1839, but taking a death mask to remember the person's appearance remained common into the 20th century. In the early hours of October 17, 1849, shortly after Chopin passed away, the sculptor Auguste Clésanger was summoned to 12 Place Vendôme to create a death mask of the composer. Clésanger, who had married Solange Dudevant, the daughter of Georges Sand, also made a cast of Chopin's left hand and later sculpted the decorative elements on Chopin's tomb at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. His involvement was not incidental. Chopin's breakup with Sand 2 years earlier had been partly due to Chopin's support of Solange's marriage to Clésanger, which Sand strongly opposed. This personal connection may explain why Clésanger was entrusted with such an intimate task at the time of Chopin's death. Impressions for death masks had to be taken very soon after death. Clésanger was in Paris and could reach Place Vendôme quickly. So rather than being chosen in a formal sense, Clésanger was the natural and convenient choice, a trained sculptor, personally connected, and immediately at hand. According to a commonly repeated account, when Clésanger took an impression for the mask, Chopin's sister Ludwika, who had been near her brother during the last 2 months of his life, was so horrified by it that she requested a second impression. It's not hard to see why Ludwika would ask. The truth is that there is no evidence that Ludwika requested a second impression because she was horrified by the first. No contemporary accounts, correspondence, or archival records substantiate this claim. It may well be a later embellishment, yet it continues to linger, repeated uncritically in many biographies of Chopin. However, what is plausible and consistent with 19th century practice is that family members often reacted emotionally to a very literal post-mortem cast, and that may have been Ludwika's reaction too. At the time of his death, Chopin was already profoundly weakened, his body further emaciated by the illness that had long plagued him, and he likely endured considerable suffering in his final hours. Charles Gavard, a young man who had remained a devoted friend and visited daily, recounted that Chopin's face had become quite black from suffocation. So it's easy to imagine that what we see in the impression taken by Clésanger could be close to Chopin's appearance at the moment of death. But how did we go from this death mask to this? According to Nadia, Clésanger clearly botched the first attempt and distorted the face. The skin looks as though it had been pressed down and squashed, which is very clearly visible when viewed from the front. In order to produce a proper second cast, and since death tissue or skin does not spring back into its natural neutral position, he definitely had to massage Chopin's face so that it looked as it had in life. Now, I had never given much thought to the history of Chopin's death masks, nor had I questioned the repeated claim that a second impression was made, supposedly at the request of Ludwika, as I mentioned. But this conversation set my thoughts in motion. How do we actually know that a second impression was ever taken? There are no contemporary accounts or correspondence to confirm it. What we do have are two strikingly different images. One, a stark, almost unsettling cast, and another in which Chopin appears serene, even angelic, with a faint Mona Lisa like smile, much closer to how Ludwika or anyone might have wished to remember him. Nadia continued, "In any case, the accounts of those present at Chopin's death and Kwiatkowski's deathbed sketches do not support the notion of significant manipulation of the second mask, apart from the bronze cast." Wojciech Grzymała, one of Chopin's most devoted friends, described Chopin's appearance in death as beautiful and looking as young as he used to. Théophile Kwiatkowski's drawings also do not resemble the first cast, but bear a very strong resemblance to the second. I'm sure we can all agree that Chopin looks better in the version of the death mask we are all familiar with. But just like Alan Walker should have provided proof that Chopin was born on March 1st if he claimed it as the definitive birth date, so should have done Nadia when she claimed that in order to produce a proper second cast, and since death tissue or skin does not spring back into its natural neutral position, Clésanger definitely had to massage Chopin's face so that it looked as it had in life. This idea is, frankly, baffling, both conceptually and practically. In early postmortem period, the facial tissues are still relatively soft and have not undergone any fixed structural deformation. Because of that, I'm not convinced that the pressure of a first plaster impression would create lasting depressions in the face that would then needed to be manually corrected by massaging the tissue before taking a second impression. Plaster can certainly exert slight local pressure during application, but the idea that it would permanently displace facial features in a way requiring restorative manipulation goes beyond what is normally understood about both the material process and early postmortem tissue behavior. Looking at the plaster cast from the impression, I also don't see a face that appears mechanically distorted or pressed out of shape. What I see is a gaunt, expressionless face, the relaxed facial tissue of a dead person, with traits consistent with severe illness and weight loss, likely reflecting Chopin's condition at the end of life rather than any deformation caused by the casting process. Yes, his mouth is droopy, and it's possible that the impression might have slightly distorted it. But right after death, when the body enters primary flaccidity, the muscles around the mouth relax. As a result, the lips may part slightly, the corners of the mouth can fall or soften, the jaw may drop open unless supported. So we could allow for some looseness in the face as being responsible for Chopin's appearance in the cast. Even setting all that aside, the so-called second mask raises additional questions if we assume it is still a strict death cast. The slight smile. This would be very difficult to attribute straightforwardly to passive postmortem muscle relaxation alone. This would suggest some later intervention to give Chopin's face a peaceful appearance. The presence of hair. Death masks generally do not capture hair as a structural element of the cast. If hair appears, it is added later as part of the presentation. In the case of Chopin's cast, the added hair helps frame his features, which in the so-called first impression appear almost improbable, given the image of Chopin with a full head of hair that has become familiar to us. Skin surface. There are noticeable differences in the skin surface between the two masks. In the first one, what seems to be residual plaster that was never fully cleaned makes Chopin's appearance even more unsettling, as if he hadn't shaved, for example. In the final version, however, the surface is smooth. This would point to a later stage of refinement of the surface, because one would expect the same residual material to be present in the second impression as well. The timeline. There's something in the timeline that doesn't quite hold together if we take at face value the story that Ludwika requested a second impression. For her to be able to judge the result of the first impression, she would have had to see the actual cast produced from it. Clésanger would have needed time to let the initial mold set, prepare it, and produce a positive cast for viewing, a process that would have taken a few hours. That's time he likely didn't have if the goal was to take another impression before rigor mortis set in. So either Clésanger recognized immediately that the first impression was unsatisfactory and immediately took another one, in which case it's unlikely that Ludwika could see what the first one looked like, or no second impression was ever taken. Instead, what we call second version may simply be the result of reworking the cast from the first impression. Then, once Ludwika saw the cast from the first impression and reacted, if that part of the story holds any truth, Clésanger then refined the features, softening and idealizing them, which ultimately produced the familiar image of Chopin's death mask we know today. I find this second scenario the more convincing. Not only were the original impressions generally discarded once usable casts had been produced, but there is also no firm contemporary documentation that a second mask was ever taken as a distinct, recorded act separate from the first. Given that sculptures were typically commissioned to produce not just impressions but finished likenesses, it is entirely plausible that Clésanger subsequently refined a plaster positive derived from the first cast in the studio. Such adjustments, smoothing the surface, softening harsh transitions, or correcting features like a drooping mouth, were standard practice rather than exceptional intervention. I superimposed the images of the two casts to compare their details, and the correspondence is striking. The eyes, with what seem somewhat exaggerated eyelids in the impression, follow the same outline in the final cast. The same thing can be said about the nose, at first glance somewhat distorted, yet following the same outline in the subsequent version. Even the ears align in the two versions. The most radical alteration is in the mouth, which was drawn closer to the base of the nose and reshaped into a gentle, almost eternal smile. The skin was smooth, and hair was added to give the cast dimension, greater depth, and presence. This, I think, is the most likely explanation. What we interpret as the second mask is not the outcome of a separate impression, but the result of deliberate reworking, transforming an unvarnished imprint into the composed memorial image of Chopin that has come down to us. However, it's important to distinguish the slight retouching from a fundamentally altered facial expression. The latter moves the object away from being a strict death mask and into the category of sculptural interpretation. If we look at the two side by side, the contrast is striking. One feels like a document of death, the other like the beginning of a monument. And yet, apart from the expected touch ups, changing the mouth and adding the hair is all it took. Single handedly, what made Chopin's mask appear less like an unmediated imprint of death and more like a consciously shaped likeness. It's something of a miracle that the first impression has survived, given how easily this kind of items was often discarded. It's an important document because it preserves the marks of Chopin's suffering, the starkness of his final moments. And while the death mask we are familiar with today may not be a death mask in the strict sense, but something modeled from that initial impression, it reframed Chopin in a softened, enduring image meant to be remembered, where death is no longer suffering, but peace.